Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. My name is Mostafa al-Badawi. I welcome you to the Bradford Literature Festival. We're going to talk and discuss the inner meanings of Islamic civilization in general and Islamic architecture in particular, which subject I think, is imperative for all young Muslims to be acquainted with, to reconnect them with their ancestors and the profundity of their lives, as opposed to what we live in nowadays. But first, let me introduce a friend of mine, architect Waleed Arafa, who's an Egyptian young architect, who is actually putting into practice what I just talked about. I talk, he builds. So he's already built a few mosques according to the inner spirit of the Islamic religion, and other buildings as well. And we're going to start with him as an introduction to the subject. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.
Bismillah wa salatu wa salamu ala Rasulillah Sayyidina Muhammadin wa alihi wa sahbihi wa man wala. I'm Waleed Arafa, and I'm very happy to have been invited to share my little experience with you in the Bradford Literature Festival. My thanks are specifically extended to Dr Mostafa al-Badawi, whom I consider my father and my master in excellence, for inviting me to share my experience of the design and build of the Basuna Mosque in Sohag, Egypt. But before I start, I'd also like to extend my greetings to Shaykh Abdal Hakim Murad and congratulate him for one of many services that he has offered us as human beings in general, but particularly as British people and British Muslims. And the last service, but not the least, but the most recent service, to be more accurate, is the Cambridge Mosque, which I consider personally, as someone who has studied mosques in Britain, a great leap towards British mosques rather than mosques in Britain. So thank you very much for this wonderful mosque you have given us all, and that I've personally enjoyed praying the first Jummah in a couple of years ago. So Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim, we start with, I'm going to share my screen right now to share with you my journey in translating what I have learned from the scholars and the learned people. And specifically here, we are talking about Dr. Mostafa al-Badawi with all the principles, the great principles he has brought to our attention in a very understudied subject, which is the spiritual significance of Islamic architecture, in his book titled the same, The Spiritual Significance in Islamic Architecture. So I will just share my screen right now, and we'll start seeing how these principles were attempted to be applied in the project of the Basuna Mosque in Sohag in Egypt, which alhamdulillah, Allah helped me complete in 2019. So in 2014, I was doing my postgraduate studies in the Architectural Association in London, and my thesis, I was particularly writing my thesis, and it was about the mosque in Britain, and it was a question mark, is it British heritage or not? Which is an introduction to understand also the mosqueness of mosques all over the world, but through the medium of Britain, where this particular question has not found answers that we can call satisfactory. Anyhow, so this was the time I was doing this, and then I was summoned to Egypt by Shaykh al-Azhari, who was helping the people of the village of Basuna in Sohag, Egypt, which is 500 kilometers south of Cairo. And then the construction begins. These are pictures that are taken from the minaret, which is about 30 meters high. Looking down, we can see the 108 pendentive domes, all looking towards the north. This is the Qibla wall here. And then we have the central dome, and the first corner is happening to create an octagon to prepare for the first circular plan that is going to be the base of the dome. And then step by step, the dome is happening. We can see the compass here in action. And then, alhamdulillah, here a picture of the completion. And if we look close, we can see that the shadow, alhamdulillah, is regular, which tells us that the job was done at a very with very high accuracy. Alhamdulillah. Another picture showing the pendentive domes before the installation of the glass. This was during the construction, but also to show the process. We'll go through that very fast. Internally, inside the dome. All of these are shots to show the accuracy of the block work and how that works with the sun, the light, and the shade to make us more in harmony with the nature around us. Here, very fast, I'm also referring again to the first stance towards heritage, which is if we have an ancient solution that still works till today, then there is nothing wrong with doing it. I mean, Dr. Mostafa often says that man has been drinking water when he's thirsty or when she's thirsty since the dawn of humanity up until now. Nobody says we need to renovate this or introduce a new solution. We still drink water to this day. So for instance, the problem here, because for windows and door, or anything that is made out of wood in Upper Egypt, is an incredible variation in temperatures between night and day and between the seasons, which would create shrinking and expansion, and which then would ruin any woodwork. And the only solution that we've seen so successful since maybe the times of the Mamluks, or maybe even before them, is this what is known, and that's a wrong name, but what people call arabesque. The right name is the al-ma'qali, ma'qali wood, like the detail that we see in front of us. And so I decided to do all the doors and windows using the same technique. The craftsmen that can do that are becoming extremely rare and unique and hard to find. But alhamdulillah, we found someone, and we did this lattice work, ma'qali, which followed the same geometrical proportional system that I was using through the entire mosque, which is another point here, diversity within unity. I followed one proportional system that, but we showed different manifestations, aesthetic and visual manifestations of the same geometry. These are the details of the door. The doors are very large, and so this technique was needed to avoid expansion. We can see the young man standing next to these doors is my younger brother. He's 185 centimeters, so you can imagine how big the doors were. But then again, this ma'qali detail that also secures privacy, because when it's close to the onlooker on the interior, he or she can see everything on the outside, and it's not the other way around. So this idea itself inspired another detail that I wanted for the staircase of the ladies' areas, because in Upper Egypt, it's the society, I mean, females are not very comfortable to be mixing with men outside of their family. And so in order for us to make the place welcoming for them, we needed to secure some kind of privacy. This was a trial in Lego, and then on the 3D, and here is the execution. So these little openings, people, when they're standing behind them on the staircase, they can see clearly outside and air can filter through, but then it gives them full privacy. As we can see when we look at it from the other angle. And then we're talking about the Cube of Cubes, which is an art installation done by Dr. Mostafa with the 99 divine attributes of Allah and names. But here it needed to be readapted. So it was flipped over in the other direction to be able to enable it to work as a mihrab, which needs to be a concave space in the direction of the Qibla. So these are pictures of the process. And again, we can see it all here in the 3D, and then we can see the final product, or the final images of the building after it was nearly completed. So the cemetery is on the right hand, the main street is on the left, the main entrance we can see over there. We're almost done. Here we can see the main the wudu area, and we've covered that later on, because in the summer the sun attacks that. The wudu and toilet areas underneath and outside of the axis of the Qibla, which was a problem in the old mosque. Shoe racks, the entrance under the entrance dome. And from here, we can see the window that overlooks the cemetery, which is the building's way of telling you pray as if this were your last prayer. So you enter into the space. This image here shows us the old with the new, and with the new usage of the old. So the old, like the ancient, like the Cordoba Grand Mosque, the entrance dome, the completely innovated and new, the central dome, and the pendentive domes that are actually very ancient elements, but that were used in a different way for the first time as wind catchers and skylights. Which also, when we look up, if we're inside the mosque, we look up, we can see the sky. It's another way of connecting, protecting you from the elements, but connecting you with the cosmic phenomena. All of these are pictures of the mosque in its complete state, without people, but hopefully now there's an image that shows you people during the Friday sermon. You can see the mihrab here, the cube of cubes, with divine names inscribed on them. This is a picture looking up. You can see the central dome. And you can see how the sun marks the time on the dome internally. This is at night. during the Friday sermon, on the outside, and then we can do the same round, but this is the staircase that takes you up to the ladies, exclusively ladies section, and downwards to the multi-purpose area that receives the increase of in the worshippers' numbers during Ramadan or Friday prayers. But during the rest of the year, it functions as a place that can receive medical services, temporary medical services, and tutelage and different social services for Muslims and non-Muslims alike. So this is it. This is the lower ground floor. This is the exclusive mezzanine for ladies. So the ladies can pray on all 3 levels. Those who wish to be completely in seclusion can go up to this level. And then other ladies who do not mind going into the main praying space, they don't need to use any stairs, and they can go just into the main space and behind barriers different in height, and just which is an idea that, although I finished this mosque before the Cambridge mosque, but it's an idea and a lesson I learned from the Cambridge mosque, catering to different preferences for the ladies. So more pictures of the mosque. This is the what you see from the side of the cemetery, so with the single window in the building. It's all clad in Egyptian sandstone, so local materials. And then it's the same tour, but at night. So we go through the main entrance again. And under the the entrance dome into the main space. These cubes were made out of Egyptian alabaster, which is translucent. So there's lighting placed behind it. And that's it. Thank you very much for listening. And I hope I wasn't too long. And thank you, everybody, again. Thank you. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullah.
Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. والصلاة والسلام على أشرف الأنبياء والمرسلين سيدنا محمد وعلى آله وأصحابه أجمعين. It's a particular personal pleasure for me to be able to enjoy the blessings as well as the intellectual insights of Sidi Dr Mostafa al-Badawi, who, as many viewers will know, has been a significant contributor to the nascent intellectual life of the English-speaking Muslim world, with his translations of some of the great Alawi classics of Imam al-Haddad and Marhum Ahmad Mashur al-Haddad, his book Man and the Universe, a number of other significant contributions, and most recently his amazing book on the spiritual significance of Islamic architecture. So it's my privilege, Dr. Mostafa, to be able to engage with you this evening. Thank you so much.
Pleasure is all mine, Ya Sidi. Marhaba. Thank you for having me.
So I'd like to keep this fairly informal and try and get out of my ivory tower and look at some of the human as well as the spiritual realities that you're probing in the book. I suppose one point of departure might be to try and see how it fits into your own intellectual journey. Why, at this stage of your writing career, have you decided to expend very considerable resources and time producing this beautifully illustrated set of apausu into the realities of Islam's very diverse architectural intelligent legacy? So why this book at this point in your career?
Oh, this is a story that started a long time ago. Lots of people have written on Islamic architecture. Many of them have pointed out that there has to be some meaning. A few suggestions were made, some very beautiful. but never in detail. And I was looking for that a long time ago, when we understood that everything in the universe has meaning, that nothing Allah has created is meaningless, that everything is interrelated, that there is correspondence between the levels of existence, between the levels of reality. And that meant that everything, practically everything you can see, hear, or in any other way perceive in the universe has meaning. The question is how to actually perceive these meanings. They taught us that there are 3 books in the universe. There is the written book, the Quran. There is the universal book, the cosmos. And there is the human book, the human soul, and the human physical form as well, both. So it was a long journey to begin to understand the correspondence between all 3. If you understand a verse of the Quran, it has to indicate something in the universe. It has to indicate something in your heart. If you understand something in the universe, it has to refer to something in the Quran and something in your heart, and so on. So my idea was that every kind of Islamic art has to have meaning, just like everything else Allah has created. This is the creation of human beings, but since in Islamic art, human beings only create that which Allah has taught them, that which He has inspired them with through the Quran and Sunnah, then there had to be meaning in man-made things, just as there is meaning in Allah-made things. So looking for that bit by bit over the years, I gathered a little reservoir of meanings attached to Islamic art in general, but more in terms of architecture and calligraphy in particular. Now, putting that together started to bring out a pattern. And searching for meaning, one has to read the writings of those who approach the subject from the spiritual point of view, and those who approach the subject from a art historian point of view. Now, the art historians are generally not interested in meaning. They're interested in the historical development of styles and forms and things. The spiritual people are interested in meaning, but they have not so far done it in a systematic manner and detail, which is what I was looking for. What I was looking for was not what the architect wanted to do as much as what the user of the mosque, the lay user like myself, should perceive around him in terms of reminding of Allah and the last day. So gathering the information bit by bit over the years and using the pattern to understand bit by bit, it took a long time. And eventually, I think I've just scratched the surface, but sufficiently to show that there is a lot to be found in there, that a user like myself, when he enters the mosque, will find a lot of meaning, a lot of reminders all around him. And it took the best part of 20 years to achieve that.
Yes, I particularly appreciated the rather unvarnished way in which you involved yourself in the current cultural wars about the deeper significance of Islamic sacred spaces in particular. You quote Abu Saif and Oleg Grabar and some of these sort of, as it were, externalist interpreters of Islamic architectural forms, those who believe that essentially one is looking at a composite, a collage of earlier traditions of manufacture, of geometry, of what was, in terms of the engineering possibilities of the time, feasible. And you seem to be moving away from that in a direction that I think many others are beginning to do. I don't know if you've looked at Simon Amira's book on the Kaaba, for instance, which is, I think, the first book from an art historical perspective on the Kaaba. And I just finished it recently and really quite reassured to see the extent to which he moves beyond the older explanations in the direction of recognizing that, of course, these things are part of a very complex, sophisticated, symbolically oriented cosmological civilization that believes, as a matter of faith, that behind all forms and geometrical realities and symmetries in the universe, there is a resonance in the higher world. So I think it's, I personally found it very refreshing that you were able to come down on the side of the angels in that debate, as it were. But of course, what they would say, looking at a book such as yours or Simon's book, is, of course, there is an aesthetic and a sense of transcendence that is, in possibly obscure psychological terms, conjured forth by these symmetries, by these juxtapositions of pattern and of color. But ultimately, the affective state generated by that kind of architectural conjuring with some of the more numinous possibilities of the human soul is something that cannot really be subject to some kind of discursive analysis. It's like, in a sense, writing about music. We all know that music can take us to certain exalted, interesting, emotional, perhaps spiritual places, but actually defining those in the flat web of words is a little bit disappointing. So I wonder if you've come up with any particular reflections on the extent to which human language can actually do justice to something that ultimately is the conjuring with experiences that through the imaginative capacities of the human mind lead us to a transcendent elsewhere.
Well, with perceptible forms anyway. And you read the Quran, these are letters printed in black and white on a page, and you start from there. And then now we know that we have three main levels of being for a human being, which are the physical, the psychological, and the spiritual. Now, starting from the physical, Allah has told us to do the prayer in a certain physical way, which has a psychological impact. And then it has a spiritual meaning. Now, the spiritual meaning starts by being something that is easily understood and graspable. And then if it sends you higher up, then you go into a formless dimension where things are perceived without them. So it all has to start with a form, a physical form, and then go up. Problem is that most people would stop at the psychological effect of things. You know, this makes me happy, this makes me sad, this makes me thoughtful, etc., etc., which is, in effect, the effect of music on most people. They would hear the tunes and the melodies, and then they would stop at the psychological feeling that it produces in them. Whereas some kinds of music are obviously inspired and designed to produce a higher spiritual state than that. Architecture and calligraphy are just the same. You start with a form. The form triggers off thoughts, and thoughts, concepts would rise up until eventually it has to connect with one of the beautiful names of Allah, one of the attributes of divinity. And that is the ultimate goal of art in general. It should be like that. It should be something that starts from a form to remind you of Allah. It reminds you that the word is nothing but a tissue of the names of attributes of Allah and nothing else. There's nothing in existence except the names and attributes of Allah reflected on the mirror of creation. So anything that succeeds in triggering this off in your mind, in your heart, then that is sacred art.
So you're fairly optimistic about the possibility of creating some kind of theology of Islamic aesthetics that isn't just about sort of psychosomatic reflexes that the brain generates when it encounters a particular environmental space, but is genuinely something that could be described as an encounter with transcendence. You think that can be done in some systematic way?
The feeling of peace and tranquility and satisfaction and contentment that an old traditional mosque causes in the heart of most people who are not thinking about symbolism, are not thinking about the mere feeling. When you enter one of these old mosques and sit down, you feel that you're already in heaven. That cannot be coincidental. It cannot be accidental. It has to have been designed by the architects, and the architect who designed this must have been inspired by some higher spiritual understanding, by somebody who had the spiritual means of inspiring him to produce such a. It's a universal feeling. I think everywhere. If you go to a mosque in Morocco, like you go to a mosque in Samarkand, it's the same thing. You enter in the mosque if it's an old mosque, traditional mosque. Of course, what makes the point even more clear is that the current, what I call plastic mosques, the flashy new constructions that are designed by architects anxious to get the thing into the modern world and producing really. Now, what you feel in there is the exact opposite. You feel you're restless, you're uptight, you want to finish your prayer and get out as soon as possible. You don't want to stay there forever like in the traditional mosque. It's a major difference, an essential difference. And that makes the old mosques even more, it makes the feeling even more clear to people. It's clear in people's mind that there is a difference. This is something that is felt, yes, at the psychological level, but then there are things that people absorb from the surroundings in a mosque and from the meanings and the decorations and the arabesques and the things that are subliminal. They understand the meaning without actually having to explicitly think about it.
Yeah, I particularly appreciated the way in which, again, quite outspokenly, you, as it were, turned the book into two narratives. First of all, there's the theology of Islamic sacred spaces, but there's also quite a hard-hitting diagnosis of the state of the contemporary Muslim soul as it engages with and generates some sacred spaces. And as you say, it's a sorry circumstance. Obviously, to make that diagnosis more extensively would require a series of books, because you're talking about spiritual malfunction of the entire ummah, really, and you can see the same kind of externalizing and asymmetrical cacophony elsewhere in the contemporary Muslim reality. But it's one thing that I heard when I lived in the Middle East, when I was asking people why it was that they deliberately, it seems, built structures that defied universal as well as Islamic principles of symmetry and harmony, was that if the modern Muslim goes into a traditional harmonious space, he will feel so alienated and out of place that he won't be able to pray there. He needs the continuation of his brokenness in the place of worship before he can really feel relaxed and at home. Otherwise, he'll be too disturbed. I accepted that as kind of half an explanation as to why, at some considerable expense, modern sacred spaces are created in the Muslim world that seem to be deliberately in defiance of traditional and universal Islamic ideas of harmony, that the harmony simply cannot be borne any longer. It causes too great an agitation in the soul. Do you think that's too cynical of you, or is there something to be said for it?
No, I don't think that in this time age you can be too cynical. We're hitting rock bottom, actually, but there are some good signs. I can see a few young architects who have started by actually studying the religious sciences together with studying architecture, so that when they produce what we would call innovations. They would be coming from a background of solid religious grounding, so that they would not be tied up to the styles of old, feeling that they have to copy what was successful in the past. But at the same time, what they produce is inspired entirely by their Islamic identity. One of those is architect Waleed Arafa, who's done a mosque that has become now rather famous in a town called Basuna in Upper Egypt. He has not copied anything. He's done something which is totally new and at the same time entirely Islamic in spirit. So that was what we were aiming at that people would absorb the principles, and then out of this would come something that is a new style suitable for the age, with material suitable for the age, and at the same time entirely Islamic, because the spirit is entirely Islamic. So this is beginning, inshallah.
Yeah. No, I think that there are, as it were, voices crying in the wilderness, and hopefully they will become more numerous. And it does go back some time, because I recall that my first experience of visiting Cairo was an opportunity for me to visit Hassan Fethi, who I don't think does enter your book, perhaps because his interest is in vernacular rather than high culture. But he struck me as somebody who sought actually to inhabit, as well as simply in a kind of ideological way to perpetuate an idiom. And of course, he went on to serve the American Muslim community by building Dar al-Islam in New Mexico using his traditional Nubian masons. So he flew out of Aswan and Luxor and took them to Albuquerque, New Mexico, and did something quite remarkable there, an award-winning structure, which has become a kind of iconic jewel in the crown of American Islam. So that was, I guess, 40 years ago. And I'm not sure that there's been an immense amount of progress since then. But what particularly fascinates me, and I still don't have a sufficient answer, is the extent of this intimas al-basira, or the kind of putting out of the capacity for insight and subtle vision that seems to have afflicted the modern Islamic world. I recently read a book by Tessa Codrington, who's one of the long-standing expatriate members of the Tangiers community, which is, of course, a place where a lot of slightly bohemian Westerners have sought to go, and where they've enthusiastically bought up traditional Arab houses and filled them with traditional Arab objets d'art, carpets, fountains, and so forth. But their Moroccan neighbors want nothing to do with this, and they want concrete villas of what they take to be the latest Western style. And towards the end of the book, when she talks about the destruction of Islamic Tangiers and the attempts of these Westerners to hold on to what's left, she says that she talked to one of her Moroccan neighbors who said, "What you Europeans like, we hate, and what we hate, you love." And there seemed to be absolutely no overlap, that these elite Arabs were completely hostile to the idea of having any residual relationship in their domestic spaces with their own heritage, despite the fact that their European expatriate neighbors seemed to be in love with it. And the absoluteness of that really struck me. I don't know if you've personally encountered that particular mindset and the difficulty of explaining that the Arabs actually have a glorious heritage and it's not something that they need to be making war on.
Yeah, the glorious heritage they want to put into the museum, not live it. Hassan Fethi, unfortunately, came too early. The time was not ripe, and consequently, he never had the chance to do everything that he wanted to bring everything to fruition. So, as you say, it was 40 years before somebody else, stepped in and began doing something else. What happened really goes back to the beginning of the colonial age, when the Muslims were really taken by surprise by the the might of the invading armies, and they thought that, you know, these people are so powerful and have so powerful guns, then they must be right. So they said, if we are to resist this and be able to regain our independence, we have to be as strong as they, in their manner. So they just dropped their traditional intellectual heritage and adopted wholeheartedly, unfortunately, the most superficial part of the Western civilization, thinking that in that way they would catch up. Obviously, such thing doesn't work. If things are not do not spring from the essential part of the Islamic civilization, which is their aqidah and their spirituality, then it cannot in any way be Islamic. It might be, I mean, they might catch up with some technological development or something, but the Islamic ethos, the heart, the spirit of Islam disappears. So it has actually disappeared from the hearts of a lot of people who think themselves good Muslims. They pray, they fast, they don't do anything wrong, and they do PhDs in Harvard and other places, and they think that they were able to combine Western technology with Islam, which is if you don't approach technology from inside the Islamic spirit, if you don't measure everything according to Islamic principles, if you don't order your mind according to the Islamic model, then what you do cannot be Islamic. It could be technologically perfect, useful, but it cannot be Islamic. So a lot of the intelligentsia in Islamic countries have actually dropped their intellectual heritage, are no longer interested in their intellectual heritage. They're interested in acquiring recent technological knowledge, and just because they call it by Islamic names, they think it's become Islamic. So this is a superficial way of thinking that makes people still want to live in concrete buildings rather than in... It was one of the principles of architecture all over the world, not just in the Islamic world, that you have to build with the material readily available on site.
Yeah.
You live in a forest, you build with wood. You live in, like in Cairo, for instance, you know, they have, they build the Mamluk architecture was all made of rocks because they were available since the pharaonic times. If you live in the desert, then you have to have tents made of camel hair and goat hair, and so on. Concrete is the exact opposite of that. And then the utilitarian mentality that came in with the advent of socialism and things. People thought that, you know, if you're a human being, then you need a cube 2 meters by 2 meters to work, another cube to sleep, and a third cube to pray. And that was it. That's what you needed, and that's what you got. And so you had these apartment blocks with tiny little apartments that caused constriction in the psyche of people and made delinquents out of the young people just because of the lack of space. This utilitarian mentality became pervasive for decades in Islamic countries, and the result was the obliteration of all traditional Islamic architecture. People no longer thought in those terms. But that goes back to the current mentality, and that's why when some Westerners rediscover the traditional way of life and are fascinated by it and want to. The Muslims next doors don't understand what they're doing. Why are you doing this? I mean, we have here ACs and all kinds of gadgets. You know, what is so fascinating in an old house? They don't feel the peace and tranquility that old houses give. They don't feel that it is much more healthy physically and psychologically to live in one of these traditional old houses that were designed to provide maximum physical and psychological health as well as spiritual meaning.
Yeah, I remember a long time ago once showing old Cairo to my father, who had been a quite distinguished architect and had been advisor to the Queen and so forth, and was part of that sort of modern architecture establishment. And we walked down the street called Bain al-Qasrain, which no doubt you know, going up to the Bab al-Futuh from the kind of Miski area. And it's surrounded by wonders. Apparently, it's the world's largest concentration of medieval monuments anywhere on the planet. You've got the Mosque of Sultan Barquq and the Madrasa Sultan Qalawun. You have the tomb of Shajarat al-Dur. You have the enormous Mosque of al-Hakim Bi'amrillah. It's an extraordinary showcase of architectural brilliance. And my father was kind of goggling at this because there's nothing really like that anywhere in Europe. You don't get one cathedral next to another cathedral, next to another. It's kind of one in each city. But in Cairo, you've got many next to each other. And he could not believe, the quality of the stonework, the brilliance with which the buildings related to each other. And then he said, where did these people go? Where are they now? Which is the good question, of course. And I said, they all died, was basically it. And there's no interest amongst the Egyptian elites, whether religious or secular, to even visit those places. If you go to the Mosque of Sultan Barquq, which is a wonder, and people keep writing PhD theses about it, the custodian has to pay for the light bulb himself because the Wizara can't be bothered to look after it at all. It's ruinous in a completely calamitous state. So the extremity of that is what interests me, that there is really nobody who seems to be interested apart from the Aga Khan occasionally sweeping in and tidying up some areas. But it is remarkable the extent to which Sunni Muslims seem to be completely blind to these wonders, whereas everybody else is loving them to bits. You'd have thought that even for the tourist trade they would do something to flag up those wonders, but there seems to be a policy of malign neglect, I think.
Well, that's part of the story. You see, craftsmen in Islamic countries in general very seldom wrote down the details of their crafts.
Mm-hmm.
They passed them on orally, and there were what today is anthropologists would call initiation rites. The apprentice had to pass certain tests to be taught the next level.
Yeah.
And they kept that as more or less secret from everybody else. There were these guilds of craftsmen, and they had their craft well preserved. So there was a sanad, a chain of transmission for crafts, just as there were sanads or chain of transmission for hadith and for fiqh and for everything else in the religion. So there was a sanad, an unbroken sanad from the earliest craftsmen of more than 1,000 years ago until very recently.
Yeah.
And then they said, we want a Western-style university. And then they created a university during the reign of King Fuad of Egypt, and they brought in Italian and French architects to teach architecture, at which point the sanad was broken. There were no more chains of transmission, because the old muallims, the master builders, who very often were illiterate, they knew nothing about writing, but they could gauge the proportions of a building just by looking at it. So that art, that very precise art of Islamic architecture lost its chain of transmission, and we had these new generations of Italian-trained architects who built a lot of lovely buildings in the town center in Cairo. Most of lovely buildings, but in no way Egyptian or Islamic. Entirely Mediterranean, like in Genoa or in Athens. It's the same. The same feeling you get in the street in the middle of Cairo, in the middle of Alexandria, as you get in Athens or in anywhere on the Mediterranean coast. So it's at that point that the Sanad was lost. And when the Sanad was lost, all the architects could do, if they wanted to preserve something of their traditional heritage, was to copy the old buildings, or if they wanted to be a little innovative, they would take elements from different buildings, from different eras, and try to combine them into something new that wouldn't, at the same time, be entirely alien. And that worked for a few decades. And then inevitably, there came a generation of architects who wanted to do something entirely new to keep up with the times. And then we had these horrible new things that are neither Islamic nor even reasonable. So that's what happened. What architects now have to do is to reconnect the Sanad by actually digging out the real art of Islamic architecture and reviving it.
Yeah, I mean, in terms of the Middle Eastern countries, the situation is quite dire, as you suggest. But in Morocco, I think that the traditional crafts and the guilds have more or less been maintained, albeit in a minor key, by various, usually royal initiatives. There are people who can make the traditionals, the liege, who know how to run water to a traditional fountain. The rug making industry is still there. And also in Indonesia, which I visit from time to time, the traditional mosque building traditions, raising the traditional three-peaked Javanese mosque from teak is still in existence for rather different reasons, but often also because there is a sultanic survival, two sultanic centers in Java, I think in Surakarta and Yogyakarta, that the traditional guilds and the traditions of sacred architecture were actually maintained, and they are still occasionally building a mosque in a traditional Javanese style. That's one of the places where I think there is some hope. I think that the tradition is accessible there for those who are still interested. But the Middle East seems to have been hit by a kind of bomb. There's been a cultural revolution there. Again, Mao's, what Nasser did to Egypt, for instance, in terms of smashing the traditional religious infrastructure, defanging the independence of the ulama, appointing people who had no civilization east or west to ministries of culture, is particularly disturbing. It's always a sad experience when we have visits from Arab ministers of culture to Cambridge, and we have wonders to show them in the museum and in the university library, but they've never got the least idea of what they're looking at. They're more interested in shopping, frankly. That's what really animates them. So yes, the Middle East is particularly badly hit, I think. As we of course have seen in Medina and elsewhere, there really is no residual awareness of the architectonic consequences of the Islamic religion.
Which brings me to a question I've been meaning to ask you for a long time. I was very impressed to see the mosque you built in Cambridge. And I was dying to actually go in there and get the feeling from inside, because pictures, however brilliant, are not. How did that come about? How did this brilliant construction come about? Where did the idea originate?
Well, there are some countries where there is a local Islamic tradition of mosque building that you can extend. Even in places like the Balkans, Spain, there is a legacy that you can reconnect to. Of course, in our wind-blown island off the top left-hand corner of the Eurasian landmass, we've never had the blessing of indigenous Islamic culture. So when you say that you want a traditional building, it raises some very complex questions. There were some proposals for the mosque, because we had a design competition that wanted to replicate, say, Middle Eastern or subcontinental forms. And we felt that there would be an incongruity entailed by that, in that it simply would, as it were, unintentionally reinforce the claims of xenophobes that Islam doesn't belong in the UK. Often mosques in the West are designed as kind of aggressive statements of Muslim difference and otherness, which I think just plays into the hands of anti-immigration zealots who are now on the rampage everywhere. And we did have various far-right marches against the mosque as it was under construction. So we wanted to demonstrate the truth of the prophetic saying, وَجُعِلَتْ لِيَ الْأَرْضُ مَسْجِدًا, the whole earth is made a mosque for me. And the fact that the religion itself doesn't lay down any particular stylistic requirements. There isn't a requirement in Sharia for a dome, for a minaret, for those familiar stereotypical features. So the design that was finally favoured was quite adventurous and unusual, that tried to take certain indigenous Islamic and specifically Gothic, British and Gothic features, such as fan vaulting, which is identified with King's College Chapel in England, and which actually is of Islamic origin. I don't know if you've seen Diana Dark's book, Stealing from the Saracens, which came out last year, which is about how Gothic architecture basically was brought to Europe by the Crusaders, and it's an Islamic style. When Christopher Wren was asked why he chose the Romanesque style for building St. Paul's in London, he said, the Gothic style is not a Gothic style, it's an Islamic style. And he thought it was inappropriate for a house of God. So we already have that kind of distant history of having imported Muslim mosque themes and geometrical principles from the Islamic world. So reconnecting with that, I thought, was a very interesting thing to do. And then partly in response to the green sustainability agenda of the mosque, it's an eco-mosque, we made sure that we used natural materials throughout, and that the natural materials and the structures were load-bearing, so no very unlikely sort of architectonic features, no odd cantilevers and improbable unnatural angles. The arches, the wooden trees inside the building are actually, they structurally hold up the ceiling, and that imposes a certain natural form upon them. So yeah, it's a very quite risky strategy, I think, trying to create something that is British but also Islamic, but isn't just a kind of funny importation of something from somewhere far away, which never works. It never works at all. But the real test of it is whether the worshippers feel at ease in the space. And our experience has been that our community, which has some very conservative sections to it in Cambridge, is entirely in love with the building and feels that it wants to spend time there. And I always think that one of the signs of a good mosque is that you want to lie down and go to sleep in it.
Yes.
Because you feel kind of serene, Sakina is present, and you can relax. So people do that. So yeah, it's, although it doesn't look like any other mosque on the planet, it's very mosque-like when you go in, and it has a certain classical, recognizable feel to it. People find corners that they're familiar with. They all have favorite places. Their backs against a particular column. The articulation of genders is a way that Islamically is very intuitive. So it's been, we took a risk, I think, but generally the response of the community has been positive. And just in a few days' time, we've got the jury for the Sterling Prize coming along, which is the UK's #1 architectural competition every year. And it's already won a number of prizes. So we shall see. I think it's already the best known mosque in the UK. Whether it will set a trend or not, I don't know. But you must come and visit. I know you're
a risk that had to be taken.
Mm.
A risk that had to be taken.
Yeah,
it had to be a first time.
Yeah, in a sense, anything you did there would have been a risk. Even if you built a perfect replica of Taj Mahal or the Blue Mosque, that would have entailed all kinds of controversies and incongruities. So there was no easy option that we faced. But
anything new, there's no easy options for anything new, and indigenous Islamic architecture has to come one day or another. You know that you cannot carry on copying other people. In a different environment, it doesn't work.
And in the context of growing Islamophobic sentiment in British and European cities, it seems unwise for communities, when they're not required to do so by Sharia, to create a symbol of their presence that is aggressively rooted overseas.
Yes.
It's not wise to do that. The synagogues in England were aware of prejudice and always were low-key and tried to reflect local patterns, and they didn't stand out.
Patterns, yeah.
The mosques, unfortunately, sometimes quite assertively raise a fist of defiance to their neighborhood, and that makes Islam less popular, and of course obstructs the dawah process, because people, when they convert to Islam, they want to worship in a space that they can culturally recognize.
Mm-hmm. So people instinctively felt that this was Islamic.
They do. It's a very subtle and indefinable thing that people, when they have spent their lives going to mosques and attending Taraweeh and sitting during the Jummah, it becomes really part of their being. Mm-hmm. And you see people going into the Cambridge Mosque for the first time. And we had the first Jummah when the builders hadn't really finished, but they put planks outside and they said it was safe for us to use. And to get 1,000 of the local kind of owners of Bangladeshi restaurants and taxi drivers and academics coming into this new place. And then you could see they kind of sat down and they knew what the place was, and they prayed and they got out their Quran, and you could see that immediately they felt at home because it had that kind of mosquiness to it, which is really indefinable, but you know immediately.
Exactly. They felt the spirit of it was familiar.
Yeah.
The spirit of the place was familiar. It wasn't something alien to them. That's precisely what we're talking about. We need to do something new for each environment, for each Islamic environment. Obviously, something new in Morocco would be unlike something new in Samarkand. But something new that has the same spirit, so that you have the same feeling of serenity here and you have the same feeling of serenity there. And you feel that this is familiar here and this is if, for instance, I go to Nigeria and pray Taraweeh there, I would feel probably completely at home. I know what this is. I know a different kind of mosque, yes, but the atmosphere is familiar, the setting is familiar, everything is familiar. That's what we're looking for, the spirit of Islam in contemporary forms that do not. People forget that Sunnah and Bid'ah apply to everything. Not just to strictly Sharia things. Sunnah is something that comes from the spirit of Islam, whereas Bid'ah is something that is that runs counter to the spirit of Islam. Anything at all, a way of dressing that runs counter to the spirit of Islam is a Bid'ah. A building that runs counter to the spirit of Islam is a Bid'ah. So there is Bid'ah in architecture, there's Bid'ah in all kinds of arts, there is Bid'ah in our daily lives, furniture, bookcases, whatever. This is as much as bid'ah as because it influences the way. If you notice, traditional buildings almost everywhere are made with material that have no straight lines and straight angles. They blend in with the surroundings. They blend in with the environment. They don't stand out as something alien to the environment. Whereas a concrete building is all made of small spaces, straight lines and square angles. And this tends to make people psychologically so short-sighted. If you're cooped up in a small room, a square room, you tend to think in straight lines and square angles. And if you're programmed to think in that manner, then everything important in this life will escape you.
Yeah, and it's interesting that in this decade, most of the big avant-garde housing developments of the 1950s and 1960s, which were mostly built of pre-stressed concrete, are actually being taken down. And many of the others have had all kinds of sick building syndrome. And you saw what happened to Grenfell Towers, just as an example of that. This is not a normal way for human beings to live. And historically, human beings have lived in a way that reflects the nature around them. And one of the things that one appreciates in a traditional mosque is that you do get a sense of the time of day. One of the things I love about the great mosques in Java, that was my last trip to the Muslim world, is that there the sun sets exactly in the west. And they have these beautiful windows around the mihrab, so that at Maghrib time you get this amazing golden light that comes in through the rainforest and fills the space just before the sun goes down, and it makes the Maghrib unmistakably special, and you feel that you're reintegrated into the movements of the planet and the solar system. It's a form of cosmic grounding, I think, that a mosque really, because its functions relate to the movement of the sun and the moon, should be able to heal us with. I think it's a substantial way of reinserting ourselves into the natural world. But of course, if you have small windows and fluorescent lights everywhere, nature is thwarted and the soul is no longer reconnected to something which is, I think, quite primordially part of what makes human beings feel at ease.
Yes, if you notice the great big lights in the mosque nowadays, they completely spoil your tarawih for you, because you're not praying at night any longer. You pray in the middle of the day, and it's no longer tarawih. It feels entirely different. It's you lose the feeling of the tarawih prayer, which is essentially a night prayer.
Yeah. So we designed our mosque in Cambridge to have an enormous amount of natural light that comes in from above, even though people don't think the sun shines very often in Cambridge, which it doesn't. Yes. There is enough light, even from grey clouds, even in winter, for us not to need to turn the lights on during the day. So we save electricity, and we still have a sense that we're relating to the natural world around us. It's not difficult to do it. In any case, I'm wondering, looking at the book, if you have, perhaps we could end on this note, a mosque somewhere in the world that you regard as the best model that you've seen of Islamic sacred design. Do you have a favorite mosque anywhere that embodies all of the principles and values that you're speaking about in the book?
Well, I'm really only familiar with the Egyptian scene, mostly in Cairo. I've never been to Morocco, so that's a major part that I've missed. I've never been to the Indian subcontinent, which is another major division. So I've missed a lot. You know, I've only seen these things in pictures, which are insufficient to actually.
Egypt was the first Muslim country I visited, and I spent, at the age of 18, a couple of weeks before I went to university photographing and actually drawing some of the ancient mosques. I did some pictures of the Mosque of Imam Shafi'i and other mosques. Do you have a favorite historic Egyptian mosque?
No, I don't think I can actually designate one single mosque as my favorite. I tend to go to this one for that purpose, and this one for that purpose, and this one to look at that, and this one to look at this. And obviously, a lot of mosques have other attractions, you know, than the architecture. There are other things which make you go to a mosque, like the shrines of Ahl Bayt, for instance, which give a resplendence to any building, whether you approve of the architecture or not. It's full of light anyway. So no, I'm afraid I don't have a favorite mosque in Cairo.
I mean, one of the things that struck me so much about Cairo is that if you're brought up in England, and you're interested in English sacred architecture, it's basically Romanesque, Palladian, and the Gothic styles. There isn't really much else, because England wasn't on the way to anywhere. We're not really at the crossroads of things. Even when we became a maritime power, we didn't really bring in much architecture that we didn't already have. Whereas in Cairo, you have an extraordinary variety of mosques. You have the traditional hyper-style hall mosques like Ibn Tulun, for instance, or Hakim Amrillah, and the Azhar itself, the courtyard, the hyper-style around it, rather like the mosque in Medina, kind of the primal Islamic model. Cairo has some of the most wonderful examples of that. But you also have the very different Mamluk, kind of often madrasa type alternative with a fairly small, deep central space, courtyard, iwans around it, and often a quite intricate minaret pitched quite close to the main portico, and those extraordinary entrances. The entrance to the Sultan Hassan Mosque, which is probably 60 meters high or something. It's one of the biggest gateways to any building in the world, and they're really very different to the kind of earlier Arab mosques, the Fustat mosque, the ones in Old Cairo. And then you have the Ottoman experience, and of course the Mosque of Muhammad Ali in Al-Qal'a, which is a kind of strange revivalist Albanian neo-Byzantine thing that nonetheless is present when you visit it. It has its integrity as part of its time. So it's a place of extraordinary diversity, but I think I'm probably like you. I would find it difficult to point to a mosque where if I could pray Tarawih or something, that would be the place where I would feel in particularly brilliant space. I like the Mosque of Al-Mu'ayyad, which is near Bradford. That's a particularly staggering one. And of course, the Madrasa Sultan Qaitbay out in the Northern Cemetery. Tomb complex of Sultan Barqut. I used to live in Madinatul Ba'uth, which is it's where they put the foreign students at Al-Azhar, and it's not a monument of Islamic architecture. It's this kind of Stalinist thing done by some failed architect who spent a couple of years in Moscow, I guess. But the view was astounding because we saw the Arafa, the Northern Cemetery.
Yes.
I used to go strolling around there, and the Qaitbay structure in particular is certainly one of the most amazing showcases of fine stonemasonry anywhere in the world, I would say. It's so brilliant, the craftsmanship there, it's quite dazzling.
Yes, it's very intriguing why all these Mamluk rulers, who were supposed to be entirely power-oriented and the power struggle went on all the time and things, and then they built all these structures that are entirely otherworldly. They are entirely oriented to the Akhirah. They want to be buried in a place where people come in to pray. There's a mosque. There is a kitchen that feeds the poor. So that is a sadaqah that is going on, sadaqah jariyah. They have accommodation for students, and there is teaching, and then there is khanqa for the Sufis to make dhikr. So around the grave of the Mamluk Sultan, there is dhikr, there is teaching of religious sciences, there is feeding of the poor, and they have awqaf to finance all this for years and years and years and years after that. And they're all doing this. They were entirely oriented as concerned this, which you wouldn't expect in people who are, soldiers, power-hungry soldiers, basically. But they were that much imbued with the Muslim spirit that even though they were power-hungry soldiers, there were still Muslims who were looking to their akhirah in a serious manner, and were afraid of Allah in a serious manner, and were making preparations for their life to come, which was, you don't find these days in rulers in the Muslim world in general. They're not that oriented at all. They've lost this somewhere along the way.
Yeah. I mean, the Mamluks sometimes remind me of the samurai in Japan. They were essentially warriors, but they had a contemplative dimension. And when they became shoguns or barons of sort of warlord domains, they would often be great patrons of art and calligraphy and garden design and sacred architecture. But one of the treasures of the city of Cambridge is a mosque light from, we think it's either from the madrasa or the khanaqah of Sultan Shaykhun, who's one of the less known Mamluk rulers of Egypt. And I actually had to do the voiceover for the museum, which visitors to the museum listen to as they walk around, and the voice appears. So I did the one on this, and I was able to go and actually look at the thing, and they took it out of the box because it wasn't on display at the moment. And they said, "Do you want to hold it?" And I said, "No, thank you." 700 years old. And everybody knows that in that age, the Mamluk Egyptian glassware was the best in the world. Later on, the torch was passed to Venice, but at that time it was Egypt. And they still don't quite know how these single pieces of glass managed to be blown using the chemical compositions that they had with the beautiful ayat nur around it. It's a thing that dazzles everybody. Every single visitor to that hall in the Fitzwilliam Museum looks at that and imagines what that mosque must have looked like with 50 of these things hanging from the ceiling, each one with a little oil lamp in it, burning probably olive oil lamp. And what an amazing space that must have been. We've just got one that has survived the vicissitudes of time, and it's just a wonder. But Sultan Shaykhun, he lived in Egypt during the plague, and one of the things that's narrated of him is that even though he was this rough soldier who probably couldn't read or write, the Mamluks, as you know, were kind of bodyguards, slaves who were brought in from the North Caucasus, that in order to encourage people to give people a proper Sharia burial, he publicly washed a plague victim himself to show people that they should do this and they shouldn't be afraid and just chuck people into pits. So he was known for that. Not always a righteous man, but somebody who did kind of care about the Ra'iyah, about the population. The buildings are still there, of course, in a decrepit, sad place. It's done in Darb al-Ahmar somewhere. I don't know if you've seen it. It's on both sides of a narrow street, the Khanaqah on one side for the Sufis and the Madrasa on the other. One of hundreds of miracles in the city of Cairo. Some of them, of course, are described in your book. So yes, we have a few sparks from the great aesthetic explosion of medieval Cairo that have reached us even here in Cambridge. But we should conclude, I suppose. Is there any final thought that you'd like to share with us? Perhaps a discovery that you made that's important to you personally as you voyaged through this complex story of the theology of Islamic sacred spaces?
Oh, the discovery was that all the bits and pieces that people had written about here and there were all actually connected. Yeah, some people spoke about the Seal of Solomon. Some people spoke about the symbolism of the cross. Some people spoke about the void, the symbolism of the void. And then when you put all these things together, you find that it's all one story. It's all interconnected. The Seal of Solomon and the black and white bands all over the Islamic buildings and the crosses on the windows, and all this is really one thing. It all points out to a single meaning, and it's all interconnected. It's not that you can discover one bit here and one bit there and they're different and you have to understand each separately. No, the whole thing is interconnected. The whole building, actually, the meaning of the whole building is just one tapestry. It's one tissue of meanings, and one meanings bring on another, and another brings on another, and another brings on another, and it's a never-ending thing. It doesn't stop. You sit and meditate somewhere, and the meanings just come flooding in. The more at peace you are, and the more serene you are, and the more happy you are, and the more the meaning comes flooding in. Looking at a piece of calligraphy or looking at a piece of arabesque seem to be equivalent in lighting up the reminders in your mind. So the main discovery really was that it was all really unitary. It's La ilaha illallah Muhammadur Rasulullah, and then branching out of all the other meanings from this particular sentence.
So it is finally the art of Tawheed.
The art of Tawheed.
Differentiation pointing only to unity.
No.
Well, I'm sure we could extend this conversation. It's one of my favorite subjects, and I'm already thinking about when Cairo is going to be unlocked so I can go and look at those astonishing places again. But we have the photographs in your description in your book. So thank you very much, Dr. Mostafa al-Badawi. And the book is available now, Spiritual Significance in Islamic Architecture. And I think it will be a really valuable and also beautiful journey of discovery.
Thank you very much, Shaykh Abdal Hakim. Pleasure is all mine. Thank you.
I strongly recommend it. So thank you once again, Dr. Mostafa, and barakallahu feek. Assalamu alaikum.
Thank you.